Hey there! Thanks for listening to the INFEMIT podcast, where we want to challenge the people of God to see the realities of their context and reflect on and reformulate concepts such as mission, missionary, mission field, holistic mission, and more. In this episode, we feature a Q&A session that we had with Martin Accad, continuing conversations from the Stott Bediako Forum on Jesus and Empire, Christian witness in the context of power. Join us as we listen and learn more about Martin's contribution on Jesus and Revolution, leading a change movement and reinvesting the public space. Martin was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, and lived the most formative years of his life through the Lebanese Civil War of 1975 to 1990. His first degree in theology is from the Near East School of Theology. He then obtained an MPhil in Eastern Christian Studies and a DPhil in Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. He served at the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary for 19 years. He remains on faculty at ABTS as Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations, and is an affiliate professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. In 2020, his main focus shifted to setting up a new research company, Action Research Associates, where he could pursue God's call to be involved in social and political change, as well as research on memory and reconciliation as a form of public theology. So you're aware you'll hear a few different voices while you're listening to this podcast. We are including reflections and questions received from our community members, Jayachitra Lalitha, Manal El Tayar, Ruth Padilla DeBorst, Rene August, and Nina Mantalaba. Listen and learn with us. Most of you know us by now. I'm Nina Mantalaba, INFEMIT's Content and Communications Coordinator, and I'm here with Tori Greaves, our Director of Operations, and we are very excited for this opportunity to follow up with Martin Accad regarding the presentation he gave for the Stott Bediako Forum on Jesus and Empire, Christian witness in the context of power. Martin is zooming in today from Beirut, Lebanon, and his original presentation is titled Jesus and Revolution, Leading a Change Movement and Reinvesting the Public Space. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nina. It's a pleasure to be with all of you again, and I'm happy that we can pursue this conversation.
Martin, if I guess I can start with the question that I had while I was watching your presentation. You mentioned in your slides that change comes from outside the elites, and that is often driven by despair met by true compassion. What are some ways you have found most helpful for amplifying prophetic voices from the marginalized, maybe even specifically if you are in the majority?
Well, I think maybe one of the first things is to show true openness to those voices, and to demonstrate both in word and action that you're not that you care more about the voices from the margins than about the voices in the mainstream. I think that is crucial. Now, for the voice of the marginalized to be heard in the mainstream, that probably is part of the question, and that is probably a more difficult part of this sort of action. And I think that that perhaps it's once you have a bit of a social momentum is when the voices from the margins can begin to be heard. So I think that's the importance of the idea of a social movement, where the purpose of a social movement is for the voices from the margins to be heard when they become enough of a challenge for the mainstream. The mainstream will not be interested in the voices from the margins until they feel threatened in their hegemony on power and control. I think that's probably the power of what we find in the Gospels, and Jesus' ability to bring out the voices from the margins, both by being a spokesperson for them demonstrating in word and deed that he, I think we can say safely that he was more interested in those in the margins than those in the mainstream in terms of having their voices heard. I know it may sound strange to say that Jesus would not have been interested in the mainstream. I think he was interested in the persons, but I don't think he was interested in amplifying the voices of the mainstream. But he was interested in amplifying the powers from the voices of from the margins. And I think he was able to build that momentum through his behavior and his teaching to the point where his challenges to the mainstream became impossible to ignore.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, Jayachitra?
I'm just trying to see whether I heard you correctly. Martin, are you saying that the situation or the cry of the majority is more amplified over against this marginalized? How did you put the last few sentences when you are saying, using the words that, are you trying to say, I mean, were you saying, sorry, it's just for correction, I mean, just for clarity, were you saying that the marginalized situation need to be amplified, or its mainline stream is already amplified and Jesus' intention was not to really highlight the struggle of marginalized? I missed the link. I may be wrong. Could you please highlight what you meant?
I think your question highlights an important factor, which is that there is a dynamic between marginalized and mainstream on the one hand, and majority minority on the other. And often where there is a deep injustice, the marginalized are actually the majority, and the mainstream is the minority. But it's a minority in power, a minority that controls the public discourse. And so, in that sense, what I'm saying is that Jesus' teaching and behavior emphasized and amplified the voice of the oppressed margins, which I think probably represented a majority. And I think that the ruling elite, which was a combination of political and religious powers, were numerically in the minority, but in terms of power, they controlled majority power. And that's the sensitivity, I think, of the whole question of minority-majority. And I've spoken elsewhere about the process not of being a minority, but the process of minoritization as a process of oppression and subjection. And so you might be part of a numerical majority, but be minoritized within a particular aspect of your identity. So for instance, as an Arab Christian, I'm in a numerical minority in the Middle East, and particularly the Arab Middle East. But I consider, so I can accept that label of being a minority and live with a very dim voice, or I can embrace the fact that I am part of a majority of Christians and Muslims that stand up against oppression and injustice. And so when I'm able to embrace that majority position, then I am empowered to speak to the minority now in power, which is oppressing. And I feel minoritized quite often by Christians in the West. So as an Arab Christian, when Christians in the West say they want to protect Christians in the Middle East, I am being minoritized. I don't need protection from my Muslim and other non-Christian neighbors who are being oppressed by a system of injustice. I am in need of being left alone, or at best empowered by others to take my place within the oppressed majority, so that together we can work against the systems of oppression, which often represent a minority in power, or is represented by a minority in power. I don't know whether that helps a bit clarify.
Yeah, that explains, your stream of thought. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Manal, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to share your question?
Hi, Martin. Hi, Nina. Hi, everyone else. This is Manal El Tayar. I work for Tier Fund. Martin, I'm struggling with the Christian identity that Tier Fund has. And I emerged out of a meeting earlier today talking about why, we were discussing whether Tier Fund should exclusively work through and with the church. And for me, it's almost unthinkable, but sometimes we need other people who can vocalize the thoughts that we have that I'm not able to put words to. And so I think I heard you speak now about the necessity to work together as a majority. If you were to speak to Tier Fund leadership as they're thinking through forging their identity, or our identity, now that I work with Tier Fund, forging our identity around only working through the church, what do you think that jeopardizes, especially in our part of the world?
Thank you, Manal. I am a little bit, I don't want to say suspicious, but I am a bit unenthusiastic about approaches that ghettoize the church, and where we set ourselves up as church almost on a pedestal indirectly vis-a-vis the world and broader society. And I don't see Jesus doing that. The parallel perhaps would be, did Jesus simply look for allies within the Jewish religious structure in order to work in society? Or did he actually very intentionally reach out to those who were marginalized largely by the religious elite? And when I think of religious elite, I think of a political and religious elite, because I don't think you can distinguish very much between them in first century Palestine as in today's Middle East. So I see that Jesus has a message that appeals to society strongly enough to draw in allies from within broader society, rather than he simply finding a safe environment within the familiar religious environment. If you think, for instance, about his encounter with Nicodemus in John 3, which I talk about in my presentation and paper, I think that what Nicodemus was trying to do was to draw him into the safe circle of religion by his first response to him is, we know that that a man like you, I don't know if he says a holy person like you, it comes from God. And I think most of us, if we were in Jesus's place, when our mates tell us this sort of thing, will be very happily embracing that nice description that was just served to us on a golden platter. But Jesus has this way of dismissing anything that would put him in a comfortable space, and he brings up immediately the question of being born again in response to that. And it, if you take it without context, it almost feels like it's really Jesus's answer is out of context. It's not connected with the question of Nicodemus. But the way that I've interpreted this is we have to hear his voice in the context of what he understood Nicodemus to be doing. Nicodemus was basically trying to draw him into this safe space of being from the descendants of Abraham, and therefore being part of the chosen people and being within God's promises without doing anything more than simply being of the right descent. And this is how you have to understand, I think, his whole image of being born again. So what he's challenging, what he's talking about when Jesus says, you must be born again, he's not talking about some nice evangelical, sinner's prayer, asking God to give us new birth. What he's doing here is he is challenging the religio-political system. He's saying, actually, being born of Abraham is worthless. Well, is, let's say, spiritually worthless. Being born from below, so he starts using these terms, being born from below, being born from the flesh. And what he's talking about is being of the descent of Abraham. And as opposed to that, he's saying you have to be born from above, from the Spirit, from God. That is what it means to be born again. It is a very powerful challenge to institutionalized religion, which is co-opted by political powers. And so I may have moved a little bit away from your original question, but what I am coming to with this is that I think that Jesus did the opposite of ghettoizing himself within supposedly like-minded religious people. And he found allies everywhere. I think his main criterion was one of justice and of reflecting the character of God. And as people allied with him, they became transformed into sonship to God as Father. So it's kind of flipping things around. You don't ally yourself with the church to change the world. You ally yourself with those who are willing from anywhere, from both the church and the world, who understand your criteria and your principles and are willing to ally yourself on clear grounds that have to do with God's justice. And then in the process, they are transformed into the likeness of Christ. How that applies to the situation of Tier Fund is something to think about strategically. What does it mean? It probably requires quite a strong clarification of core values rather than a religious identification, more of a core value identification. So I've worked with an organization whose first value is we are Christian. Some of you may recognize that immediately. And I have a big problem with that. We are Christian is not a biblical value. We are of Christ, or we are in alignment with the teaching and life of Christ or of Jesus of Nazareth. That would be a very strong and meaningful core value. Now, as a non-Christian faced with a value like that, then you have a very clear choice to make. You are not being asked to be a Christian to align with the work that is to be done, but you are committing to being aligned with the teaching and values of Jesus and his lifestyle. And I think that is very different, and that makes it accessible to anybody, not only to our safe Christian environment. I haven't, to be honest with you, I have not yet seen a Christian organization of the size and objectives of Tier Fund and others, such as World Vision and others, that are able to get themselves and their head out of the Christian framework as a moniker, this word Christian, which outside the Anglo world, or maybe not Anglo world only, but let's say the Euro-American world, loses much of its biblical meaning. Now, it may be arguable whether it still has biblical meaning in the Euro-American world, but I won't be the judge of that. But what I can tell Euro-Americans is that outside their world, the label Christian is not very meaningful from a biblical and Jesus perspective.
Thanks, Martin. I'm smiling. You can't see me, but I'm smiling. Thank you.
Blessings.
Yes, thank you so much, both for your question and your answer, Martin. I have another question I could ask. Martin, you also mentioned that change movement empowers with a vision for new possibilities. And it's interesting, in a couple of INFEMIT spaces, the phrase creative imagination keeps coming to mind. So in what ways have you found it best to cultivate a creative imagination for the future, maybe even while in wait for change?
Well, you've put your finger on my inspiration, which I've always been very inspired by Walter Brueggemann's prophetic imagination. And so the term, what is it that you mentioned? Alternative vision, is that what you brought up? Or?
I think in your PowerPoint you mentioned that it empowers with a vision for new possibilities.
Yes, these are words straight out of Brueggemann, the new possibilities for the future. And so he speaks about the prophetic role, which is this dual role of criticism and energizing. He also uses amazement for energizing. So criticism alone is destructive. Energizing alone, you're aligning with dominant power. And the prophetic stance is the ability to combine and balance perfectly. Well, he did it perfectly, as well as possible to balance between criticism and energizing. And energizing is about this prophetic ability to project an alternative vision of reality and of future possibilities. And so I think that the message of Jesus and the path of Jesus is so radically different from any dynamic of power that we know in the world, that if we really get it, he can really inspire in us, in our organizations, this ability to to offer an alternative vision of things to come. And I think that we are very weak in our ability to do that, and that applies to me as well. And I wish that I had found the way to live this out in my life sufficiently. My life is a few grains of sand in the possibilities that Jesus' teaching and example offer us in terms of prophetic stance and prophetic being in the world. And I think I've experienced discouragement in my life because I often revert back to evaluating success from a worldly understanding of the dynamics of power. And I constantly have to remind myself that success in the Jesus model is the self-givingness of the cross. And so as we seek success, we seek to adhere to biblical and Jesus values rather than to focus on achievements and outcomes. But everything in our models of project design are opposed to the idea of focusing on core values. Well, maybe it's okay with focusing on core values, but it certainly doesn't seem to be okay with not focusing on outcomes. And or focusing on material outcomes. And I think that if our outcomes were more in fact, I think those organizations that try to move to outcomes and through story rather than through statements, I think, are probably getting much closer to the kind of outcomes that could be truly measurable through biblical and Jesus standards. Whereas the criteria for success in the worldly dynamics of power would never allow you to go to the self-givingness of the cross. And that's why Jesus's path, his journey, is such a failure from the perspective of the disciples of Emmaus. And he has to reframe it for them. And it's only when he breaks the bread and reminds them through that about the fact that he had to die and be lifted up that they begin to understand what success means in the Jesus path.
Thank you, Martin. Ruth, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks. More of a follow-up, Martin. Good to see you. Just thinking specifically about that. I mean, and picking up on the Emmaus, the fact that they have to reframe their understanding of the Messiah, of his arrival and his mode of operation, then it immediately sends them back to the others, right? It sends them back to their community with this reframed understanding, and they have to kind of bring this new good news, this reframing back to the community. And so my question has to do with you mentioned discouragement. You mentioned challenges to really staying in this vein of creative imagination, of an alternative mode of measuring success. And so I would just like to hear from you what place you see community has in sustaining that for the long run, and how you find community and echoes and sustenance along the way. just in your own experience and biblically, both sides?
With difficulty and without great success. And I've often thought about my uneasy position vis-a-vis the church, at least the church as an institution, which is supposed to be our community. But I think we need to reframe this as well and see that a community of faith where the prophetic is allowed to thrive may need to be allowed to transcend the walls of churches and of institutions. And I think it is so on a personal level, it is within a community where this dual role of the prophetic is able to thrive, that I can find inspiration and strength to walk in this Jesus path. And I don't mean to say that this is not found in the church and in the local church. I think in some local churches it is very much fostered. In many it is not. And outside the church, there is also room to foster that sort of community where the prophetic imagination is able to thrive. But I find also that it is not a static thing. So you will never find the community within which the prophetic will thrive permanently. Because I like to think about the prophetic, therefore, as a way of living, as a way of being. And so it is always in danger of being quenched. And so our responsibility, I think, as followers of Jesus, is to constantly practice the prophetic in order to prevent the prophetic from being quenched. And so it is a posture of ongoing being. It is not, that you are a prophet in your community. It is, I think, that I would like to think about the prophethood of all believers rather than the priesthood of all believers. And the moment you cease to practice the prophetic within the community of faith, you become an institution. And so it is something that has to be constantly practiced. And it is something we need to constantly also take care of not allowing to die within us and within our own way of being. So we are all in constant danger of not living out our prophetic stance because it's in such opposition to human and worldly understandings of power. And I hope that my words are not coming across as judgment on the church or on Christians or on, but because I really find that it has to be constantly an individual struggle and a personal struggle, because it's so easy to lose or to stray away from the prophetic stance. And wherever the prophetic is, there is the community of Christ.
Thank you both so much for that.
I have something I'd like to share, if you will, as well, that follows up on a question that was asked in Arad that forced me to think a little bit more, which was the idea that the Gospel of John is seldom viewed or studied for its political implications, and that Johannine studies have somewhat been marginalized under the accusation of anti-Semitism in recent decades. And when one wants to find a theology of a political theology, one has to go to the Synoptic Gospels. And then the challenge that was posed was, does the Gospel of John really have anything to say about politics? Or is it not more a challenge to religious authorities? So I had to think through that a little bit over the past couple of months. And I'm quite convinced now, not only because of the context of the gospel, but also because of my own context, reflecting back on the gospel, that the most dangerous political context is the one where religious powers have been co-opted by political powers. And the only way that the Jewish elite at the time of Jesus was able to maintain itself in power was by acquiescing quietly to the political power of the Romans. And they had their various ways of doing that, including by having people collect taxes for the Romans, by having governors that work at the service of Roman powers, as we see in Herod. And then I think the entire Jewish religious leadership at the time of Jesus was pretty much working for the political powers of the Romans. And in that sense, therefore, I think we need to completely reframe our thinking about who and what is Jesus challenging when he is constantly challenging the religious leadership in the Gospel of John. So I think I would agree that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is very much focusing his critique on religious powers and on the religious structures of power. But I think that this was a very direct way. Well, even maybe because he cared more about that than about challenging the Romans, right? He was never keen on being perceived as a political zealot that was trying to set himself up as an alternative king in the face of Roman power. However, I think that he was very much aware that by challenging and critiquing the religious structures of power, he was very much challenging political power. And this is why he was crucified. It is because his challenge to the religious elite was eventually perceived as sufficiently dangerous and sufficiently a threat to both the religious and the political power that he was crucified. And the Romans tried to disentangle themselves from that religious political alliance by saying, is it Pilate who says, he's your problem, he's not mine, and he sends him to Herod. But the Romans were not able to disentangle themselves from that system that they had built in alliance with the religious elite of first century Palestine. So we must realize, and I think that is a global phenomenon these days, that when we challenge, when we live out our prophetic stance vis-a-vis the religious authorities of our own, we are representing a threat to political power. And I hope that we can see how this is manifest today in America and elsewhere, not only in my part of the world. So it's unavoidable. And so we cannot afford not to have a political theology, because the implication of Jesus's action and teaching is so political, so deeply political. When Jesus tells parables, he is challenging the political system of power. When he is healing, he's challenging the political system of power. He's challenging control. Once you start challenging control of the elite is so intrinsically political and religious, all the more so in a sectarian system like Lebanon, that it is impossible to remain safe once you begin doing that seriously. So unfortunately, I think about a question that the Western Church often asks, which is, we are not being persecuted, but, we want to go and serve the persecuted church. Well, you don't have to go and, evangelize on the church, on the city, in the city center, and have people tell you that you're, go home, you idiot. This is not persecution. Persecution is not something that you have to look for if you live in the way of Christ. If you begin to challenge the systems and structures of political and religious power, and you only have to begin with the religious power to start to see how it becomes politicized. You want persecution, you'll have it.
Thank you, Martin, for that reflection. Ruth, I invite you to speak.
I just wondered, Martin, given that that's the position you're in a way, I mean, your whole movement that you've been nourishing, that you've been spearheading and all, is in some ways doing precisely what you are advocating for. And I just wanted to make sure we don't leave this conversation without perhaps some hints on your part of how we, as those who are we're not in your shoes, we're not in your country, how we can accompany, how we can pray, what leads you give us to be a support and in some way be part of your community, even if we're not on site with you in the dailiness of the struggle.
I hope that we can see that my reality is not tougher than your reality, and in fact, mine is so much more obvious that it might be easier than your reality. I'm not sure where you are right now, Ruth, but I'm assuming North America, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so let me rephrase that. The reality of Europe and North America is so much less obvious, perhaps, that it is more challenging and more difficult than my reality, where sectarianism is so deeply rooted that this marriage of politics and religion is so obvious. So, and I think then we need to realize that when the prophetic church challenges the religious and political structures of power anywhere, it is contributing to the path of the prophetic church challenging political and religious structures of power everywhere. So I don't know. I don't know whether that addresses a little bit your question. Certainly, the challenges in Lebanon are massive, and but the broader religious structures co-option by the political system in Lebanon is so obvious that anything you do to challenge any kind of structural power, in a sense, becomes part of the gospel calling. So let's continue to sustain each other as we each carry out this struggle wherever we are in the world. And as we are doing now and through all this project, sharing the challenges, what works, what doesn't work, our inspirations and discouragements.
Thank you, Martin. Rene, would you like to share?
There sort of three pieces mulling around in my brain. The first is a framing that we've used a lot in South Africa is that of the Kairos document, looking at the church theology, state theology, so religious theology, political theology, and then prophetic theology, and learning to distinguish the nuance of the narratives between those. And so, I was curious just if you had a reflection on that in particular, but then also a question around what would allyship look like, which is similar to Ruth's question, I guess, in some ways. But then I'm also wondering, like, the more you talk about the work of the prophetic, the more I see that actually outside of the church space, that it's not just a Christian prophetic theology. It's more the prophetic action of people engaged in people who have the prophetic imagination. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So I'm not familiar, actually. Of course, I have heard about the Kairos document, but unfortunately, I cannot say I'm familiar with the content. So if there is any specific area within the document that you think you could address more specifically, that might be helpful. But to talk about the other side of the question, I think we run the danger of also, if you see, I think we've fallen into a dichotomy. So either you are a Christian organization or you are a secular organization. If you're a Christian organization, you're limiting your ability to access certain funds, to be viewed as professional, and so on. And if you're a secular organization, it for some reason somehow should become the key to professionalism and give you access to funds that are public funds. So I think that this Christic position should be clarified, should be clear. So by saying that we don't want to work only with Christians, we are not saying that we want to, that Jesus has become a little bit too narrow to allow us to be part of a bigger movement of prophetic or of change. I think it's probably as easy to become co-opted by the prophetic voice of the world as it is to be co-opted by the ghetto voice of the church. And so if we lose focus on what is unique about Christ's teaching and model as a challenge to structural power, then I think we fall in the other problem, which is numerous originally established Christian organizations that have become secular and frankly, they may be doing great things, and we might be able to view them as part of a broader prophetic action and voice in the world. But is it the transformative, Christic, prophetic power of transformation? This is where I think our big challenge lies. And this is where I think there may be some small organizations that have managed to navigate this, but I have not seen yet a major organization with Christian foundations that has been able to navigate this. And I might be not sufficiently in touch, but I have not seen that. I've been involved a little bit in trying to help a couple do that, but without success, because you always fall back to the dichotomy. It's very difficult to navigate a Christic stance, which both is professional and unique. If you are Christian, then you are putting an immediate ceiling on everyone in your organization which is not Christian by a label. If you are Christic, you are removing that obstacle and not making it about your religious social identity, but actually making it about your heart identity, about your values identity. And I don't see why a non-Christian who is Christically committed in their values cannot be the leader of an organization that has historically held on to a Christian identity, and probably better than a Christian by name, unable to navigate the Christic prophetic stance.
Rene, thank you for your questions, and Martin, thank you so much for sharing. So this has been a really fantastic conversation, and I want to thank you all so much for bringing such good questions so that we can continue exploring this topic together, and we'd love to have you with us again. Martin, would you be willing to close this time with a word of prayer?
Yes, and I do want to thank everyone for these really difficult questions. And I'm not in the habit of having pre-packaged answers, so you've forced me to reflect deeply. So I'm grateful for that opportunity. Let me pray for us. Thank you, Master and leader of the prophetic calling, Jesus. Thank you for your inspiration. Thank you for your teaching. Thank you for your challenge. Thank you for the unrest you cause in us constantly without ceasing. We call on you to rebirth us in an ongoing manner in the prophetic way, as we constantly give in, give up, die spiritually to this calling. Revive us with your spirit of life. Give us your living water. Make us born again. Rebirth us, Spirit of God, so that we might transform the world, the religious structures, the political structures, and help in the fostering of a community where the prophetic stance is honored and kept alive for the sake of the world, which you have loved to the point of death. In the name of our Master, Lord, Savior, and Guide, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the platform you prefer. If you think this could be helpful for someone you know, please share it with them. The best compliment we can receive is a referral to someone else. See you next time!